In Chapter 15, we're going to take a look at accounting for leases. And some of this you're going to be familiar with already, but some of it will be new topics to you. So let's start with the parties to a lease. You have the lessor. Typically, that's who we think of as the owner of the property, the one renting it out, if you will. And the lessee is the one leasing the property or renting it from the landlord. So you could kind of think of the lessor as the landlord, the lessee as the tenant, or the person leasing out the property, and the person leasing the property. Person leasing the property and the person they rented it from. Okay, now the kind of lease, there are actually two types of leases, and the kind that you're going to be most familiar with probably is an operating lease. It's your typical tenant-landlord situation. The landlord owns the house or apartment, they rent it out to the tenant. The tenant pays the landlord rent. It's rent revenue to the tenant, rent revenue to the landlord, rent expense for the tenant. The building, let's call it a house, would be an asset of the landlord and show up on the landlord's books, right? And they depreciate it. So that's the system you're accustomed to. The tenant pays rent, debits rent expense, credits cash. The landlord receives rent, they debit cash, credit rent revenue. Just traditional leasing arrangement, right? Here's an issue though that comes up sometimes. Sometimes businesses will call an agreement a lease, but when it's drawn up, it's really not a lease in the traditional sense that we think of, an operating lease. Instead, it's essentially a purchase. There are two types of those: a direct financing lease and a sales type lease. And we're going to look at operating leases and both types of capital leases from the perspective of both parties, the lessor and the lessee. Now, the lessee or the tenant should record a lease as a capital lease if it includes a non-cancelable lease term and one or more of the following criteria are met. Okay, so if the lease term is not cancelable, can't be canceled, and one or more of these four criteria is met. The first one, that one should be pretty obvious. The agreement specifies that ownership of the asset transfers to the lessee. Well, then it's obviously a sale and not a lease. The agreement contains a bargain purchase option. So maybe at the end of the lease term, the property is going to be worth $100,000, but we say at the end of the lease term, the party can buy it for $50,000. Then that's a bargain purchase option. What it is essentially a sale. Number 3, the non-cancelable lease term is equal to 75% or more of the expected economic life of the asset. So let's say the useful life of the asset is 8 years, right? Well, 75% of 8 years would be 6 years or more. So let's say the useful life of the asset is 8 years. The lease term is for 7 years or 6 years. Then it's essentially a sale and not a lease of property. Also, if we take the present value of the minimum lease payments required under the lease, if we take the present value of those and they're equal to 90% or more of the fair value of the asset, then the lessee would treat it as a capital lease. And when we say the lessee would treat it as a capital lease, what we're saying is the lessee, the one renting the property, and I say renting in air quotes there because they're not really renting it. If it's a capital lease, they're buying it, right? So if it's a capital lease, then the lessee would show it as an asset on their books, and the lessee, not the lessor, would take the depreciation expense. So we're going to go through several exercises dealing with leases, you guys, and maybe this is a good little video to get you started. You can also read about them in the chapter. They go into great detail, but we'll refer back to these notes as we need to. Thanks a lot, and again, please be in touch if you have questions. Thanks.